I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, Operation Protective Edge, Israel's current military action against Hamas terrorists in Gaza. And my friends, we should not misunderstand what Israel is facing right now and what things have evolved into. This may have started as an isolated act of kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teens and escalated into Palestinian riots after deranged Israeli teens kidnapped and brutally murdered a Palestinian youth. But what we're witnessing now, more than 130 rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel in the span of 24 hours, aimed at Tel Aviv, and in unprecedented fashion at Jerusalem. And there's no question that Hamas rockets can now reach virtually any Jewish city in the heart of Israel. But what we're witnessing now is not the aftermath of kidnappings and murder. What we're witnessing now is Hamas's desperate attempt to reestablish its own power in the Arab world by inflicting as much pain and hurt and death on Israelis as it possibly can, and to provoke Israel into moving ground troops into Gaza once again, an action that will cost Israel dearly in casualties and in lives, and inevitably in world public opinion. That's what we're seeing now. And the painful reality facing Israel is that it's in a no-win situation. It can't stand back and permit Hamas to force Israeli children and women and men to live in bomb shelters. And it doesn't want to engage in another ground war in Gaza, with the huge price it will have to pay. And we in America, Jews and non-Jews, should at least understand Israel's impossible predicament and be as sympathetic and supportive of Israel as we can possibly be. And for some insight on Israel's predicament, we are so pleased to have on our phones right now one of American Jewry's foremost writers, thinkers, and expert in Yiddish culture and on the problems of anti-Semitism, Harvard professor Dr. Ruth Wisse. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm glad to join you.
So, Ruth, I first want to just hear any of your own thoughts on the events that have transpired, beginning with the kidnapping of the 3 Israeli youths, right up to today. When you first, for example, heard of the kidnappings, and then finally we heard that the 3 boys were murdered, they were murdered evidently almost moments after they were kidnapped. What were your feelings? What are your thoughts? And as you look at the entire way in which the American media has portrayed the events and how the world has sort of reacted to them, I'd love any reactions and personal feelings you have shared with us.
Well, I don't think it is a question of my personal feelings. I have been witnessing this situation since the beginnings of the creation of the State of Israel and before that.
Yes.
And feeling pretty much the same things all the time. It is inconceivable to me that so many decades after the creation of this remarkable state, and after Jews regained their sovereignty in the land of Israel, and after they took it back from its occupiers after 2,000 years, after all, Israel was Jewish land that had been occupied by others. So, I have said recently that the creation of the State of Israel, as I remember celebrating it when I was very young, was the happiest day of my life. Mm-hmm. And I thought that really that was kind of the beginning of a new story, that was the end of the old story and the beginning of the new. Of course, that's not the way it worked out, and by my analysis, the reason for it is very plain. It's because the Arab world needed to organize its politics against the State of Israel. And what I tried to do several times in several places is to point out why this is so necessary for the Arab world. people casually use the word anti-Semitism, and Jews all too casually say, in each generation they rise up against us. But that isn't productive, and that isn't accurate. I think that what one has to realize is that the organization of politics against the Jews, and in this case against the Jewish state, has a very specific function for those who do it. So the leaders who organized the Arab League found in their common opposition to the state of Israel the only commonality that they could find. It was the only thing that brought together so many otherwise warring parties, nationalists and religious people could come together on this issue. Iran and Iraq could come together on this issue. We see how many divisions there are in the Arab world, multiplying all the time, and how much aggression there is in the Arab world, and how much frustration. And all of that has been organized against the Jewish state for so long. So what you said in your introductory remarks, I think, is quite accurate, that what was needed was an excuse. Summertime is always, the good time as far as, attacks on Israel are concerned, seemingly. This is just one more example of how, in this case, Hamas needs to prove what it needs to prove, and organizes these forces, in this case now rockets, which are all the more effective than they ever were before, for a whole lot of reasons. One is actually to take attention away from other abuses in the Arab world. So, what is appalling is not just the way this works against Israel. That's appalling enough. But what's appalling is that this organization of aggression against Israel, this obsession with Israel, really works to take away all the attention that could be paid and should be paid to the manifold problems that exist in the Arab world.
Ruth, I want to understand something about you. You are a distinguished professor of Yiddish literature and comparative literature at Harvard, but you're known, I would think, principally as one of the leading experts in the Jewish world on Yiddish language and Yiddish literature. And by the way, I was speaking to Ruth before we went on the air. She has a wonderful piece recently on the fact that Fiddler on the Roof is celebrating its 50th anniversary in terms of being a Broadway show. And Ruth wrote about Fiddler on the Roof as the musical compared to the Shalom Aleichem original stories. And I'm hoping one day to talk to Ruth about that. But I want to know how someone who really had made her academic mark in the world of Yiddish has become one of the leading figures on the world Jewish scene, and certainly on the American Jewish scene, very much, incidentally, Ruth, akin to what happened to Alan Dershowitz, who was a professor of law at Harvard, and over time became a major commentator on American Jewish life, and especially the relationship between America and the State of Israel. How did a professor of Yiddish literature grow to become as important a figure as you are? And I don't mean to embarrass you. What I really mean is, how did it come that your interests led you into the issues of anti-Semitism and becoming someone who writes all the time now on issues pertaining to Jewish life, especially as it relates to the State of Israel?
Well, it's a very fair question, and I think a very good question, and it's obviously one that has occurred to me over time.
Yes.
But it's not strange at all, really. If you think of what classical Jewish studies consisted of, it consisted of really studying the Talmud and studying the traditions of learning that had been handed down from generation to generation and refining them and bringing them forward. When I began the study of modern Yiddish literature, it's a literature that has to do with Jewish experience. that experience has actually been exactly what I talk about and write about. Much of what I know about Jewish politics, I have learned from the study of Yiddish literature.
Very interesting.
I can sometimes say in a comical way, what I teach is the history of Jewish mistakes, because I think that one of the things that you see that Yiddish literature traces is the many things that Jews have tried in the modern period that didn't work. All the enthusiasms that they had that were mistaken. That, too, is registered in Yiddish literature, and if you study it carefully, you see where some of the most idealistic Jews went wrong and made the wrong decisions and really brought the opposite of what they had hoped to effect. So I think that, one of the reasons I think that the study of modern Yiddish literature is so important, very different from what other people think it is. They think that this is a return to some, traditional study, and that it is like klezmer music, and that it is like Jewish humor, funny, and it's supposed to be amusing. There are extraordinarily incisive Jewish texts and Jewish thinkers. And I can find in Yiddish and, by the way, also in Hebrew literature, the basis of almost all the political ideas that I hold.
Mm-hmm. That was a wonderful answer. Now I want you to use that perspective and react to me, for me. In some way, I want you to place what's happening in Israel right now and the way the world is responding to it in the context of what seems to me to be a flabbergasting, almost an awe-inspiring in a negative way, resurgence of anti-Semitism spreading throughout Western Europe as well as Eastern Europe, that, Ruth, I thought once would be dead forever. And yet it seems to me now that there is a wave of anti-Semitism that is threatening Jewish life in ways, Ruth, American Jews do not yet appreciate. Make a comment for me.
Well, it's too big a subject to make just a casual comment about.
That's true.
But I think, again, I think that you have to look to, it seems to me that the mistake we make is that we don't understand that anti-Semitism is not primarily about the Jews. Anti-Semitism is primarily about the anti-Semites. Mm-hmm. They want to deflect attention from their problems and their pathologies by pointing at the Jews. But it is the task of the Jews to point right back at them and to point out how dangerous what they're doing is to them, as well as to the rest of the world. So when you say the rise of anti-Semitism, this is, of course, true, but the thing to do is to look where it is working, why it is working where it works, what its uses are. And I think that you find, in all honesty, that some societies, Hindu society, for example, India, does not need anti-Semitism. Hinduism seems to be much more inward-looking, much more self-accountable. And if you have a culture that is politically self-accountable, it doesn't need anti-Semitism, and it doesn't usually resort to it. Mm-hmm. So those polities, those countries, those leaders, those forces that resort to anti-Semitism are in deep trouble. And they become more and more violent because the more they try to deflect attention from their own problems, of course, the worse those problems become. And so, my sense of it is, if you're looking at the way anti-Semitism works, just look at Hitler in his bunker. That's how it works. Look at the destruction of Germany. That's how it works. Mm-hmm. And if you have things like the Holocaust museums, which I think have to be reconfigured entirely, what they should show at the end is not the Jewish corpses, but the burning cities of Europe, the destruction of the civilizations that really resorted to this horrible tactic.
All right, I have one more question, very quick. And I know all these questions deserve an hour in and of themselves. And I really hope, Ruth, one day you'll come into the studio and let me sit with you for a long discussion. But very briefly, there are people who argue that the anti-Israel movement today is an expression really of anti-Semitism. Just take a moment. To what extent do you feel that's true or untrue?
Well, I think that anti-Zionism is much worse than anti-Semitism, just as anti-Semitism was, in a sense, much worse than the anti-Judaism that preceded it. Each iteration of this idea of organizing politics against the Jews is worse than the one before, in the sense that technologically it becomes much more sophisticated, geographically it is much more widespread, it serves many more purposes. So as horrible as anti-Semitism in Europe was, it emerged in a society that still had some liberal elements within it. And eventually, when Germany was defeated, and to some extent even when communism, which was so anti-Jewish, was defeated, at least in its Stalinist form, you do have the emergence of some kind of democratic possibility in those countries. Mm-hmm. This has not yet happened in the Arab world and in much of the Muslim world. And you can see that while Hitler had to organize, for example, mass rallies, and he had to orchestrate them so with so much attention, all that Arab society has to do is to run one television program in Ramadan, showing Jews baking matzahs out of the blood of a murdered Arab child.
Yes.
And that is, pumped into every living room. So I think that, of course, it's the same phenomenon at work politically. It's organized in the same way politically in different coloration because each culture does it in its own way.
Yes.
But I do think that the contemporary use of the organization of politics against Israel is really much more ferocious and dangerous than even the anti-Semitism of Europe that preceded it.
Fascinating. Okay, Ruth, I'll let you go if you promise to one day sit with me in studio.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks
I appreciate the time.
Okay.
You be well.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Dr. Ruth Wisse, professor of Yiddish literature and comparative literature at Harvard University, and again, one of American Jewry's most well-respected analysts and commentators. And another individual who brings a wonderful grasp of the Jewish landscape is the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, someone I always look forward to speaking to, Ron Kampeas. Ron, it's good to talk to you again. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me.
All right, Ron, I want to know if you have heard, in the halls of Congress, wherever you go in Washington, D.C., what's the reaction you've heard, either from elected officials or from the administration, in reaction to the operations that Israel has now been engaged in, especially as it is now seeming to once again be ready, poised to go into Gaza if it has to? What at the moment is the legislature and the executive, White House and Congress, saying about Israel these days?
Well, the White House is especially interesting because they just put out a statement today during the briefing. Josh Earnest, the spokesman, said, "We strongly condemn the continuing rocket fire inside of Israel and the deliberate targeting of civilians by terrorist organizations in Gaza. No country can accept rocket fire aimed at civilians, and we support Israel's right to defend itself against these vicious attacks." If you'll notice, what's missing from previous iterations of that kind of phrase is a call on both sides to show restraint. They're not calling on Israel to show restraint. Mm-hmm. I think it shows that there's a sense here that there's an understanding of Israel's reaction to the intensification of rocket fire, and also the not just the intensification, but what's new here, as I'm sure you've talked about on the show today, is its breadth. And there were sirens in Tel Aviv, there were sirens in Kfar Saba, there were sirens in Jerusalem today.
That's right. But we have, we've shown our audience this app now that that Israelis have in Israel called Red Alert, and anytime Hamas fires a rocket, the app goes off and it alerts people where the rocket is going. And a lot of times the Iron Dome brings the rocket down, but it's a very uncomfortable way to live.
Sure.
And as you point out, there are entire cities now living in bomb shelters. So it's nice to hear that the administration at the moment is not trying to equivocate or soften its stance, but is basically supportive of Israel. And that's what you're saying, correct?
Yeah. I think that right now that's where they are. They are supportive. I'm sorry, excuse me. They are supportive of Israel in this. I mean, I think one of the things I was talking to people in Israel. I was talking to former generals, former security people, and they're a little surprised at the degree to which the administration is not pressing for a ceasefire. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of that is, like I've said, I think that the Obama administration, one thing that it has shown is that enough is enough. They had a similar posture in 2012. The last time there was a conflagration like this, and that was actually a very difficult time for Israel-U.S. relations. But Israeli officials at the time said the one thing they were very happy with was the fact that Obama at that time held back in terms of pressing Israel too hard. And it's always hard to mind read, but one thing that his spokesman, that are people who are close to him, keep mentioning was that he was really impressed when he was a candidate and he visited Israel in 2008 with the proximity of just your everyday little small town like Sderot to the rocket fire. He just couldn't imagine being a parent in those circumstances.
Yeah, Ron, I'm not telling you anything new. There has been in the Jewish community of America some very ambivalent feelings, very strong anti-Obama feelings in some instances, where people have felt that Obama's relationship to Netanyahu was not what it should have been, that there was disrespect shown by an American president for an Israeli prime minister. There is a feeling that when Obama went to Cairo and gave the famous Cairo speech at the beginning of his presidency, of his first term, he was much too conciliatory to the Arab world, basically reiterated the Palestinian narrative, did not seem to say that the only reason Israel had a right to exist was because of the Holocaust, and did not talk about the link, the generational link, the fact that Israel has been part of the Jewish presence as long as there have been Jews on the face of the earth. And then he didn't go to Jerusalem when he was in Cairo. And there are many people who felt that Obama has not been a good friend of Israel. And no matter what Ehud Barak says or Shimon Peres says or whatever the Israeli military says about the extraordinary degree of cooperation there's been on a military basis and in terms of intelligence and the Iron Dome and funding of Israel, no matter what anybody tries to point out for the good, there are American Jews who simply think Obama is the worst president that the state of Israel has ever had. Number one is anything happening now, and the fact that America has gone out of its way, the administration has gone out of its way, not to criticize anything Israel is doing now. And as you say, there's not this on the other hand coming out of the White House right now. Could it have any effect on the American Jewish community's view of Barack Obama?
I think, well, first of all, when you say the American Jewish community, there's the organized community, there are the voters. The voters are still overwhelmingly, not overwhelmingly, but a strong majority up in the upper 60s.
Yes. By the way, we had 70% voting for President Obama in both elections. So you're absolutely right.
And I think that the organized Jewish community, it's been back, it's been forth. It depends on the topic, it depends on the time. Like I said, times like this, having to do with Israel-Palestine and the and aggression from Hamas, they're pleased. When you talk to them about Iran, and a lot of what you just said will come up because there are still sore points here. And I think that there's some people appreciate the president when they think he's doing the right thing. In other words, they don't think he's the worst president. They don't think he's the best president when it comes to Israel. But they modulate their response depending on the circumstance and depending on how he relates to it. And others, you're just never, ever going to be able to please. I mean, I think the the issue that Obama has with Israel, a lot of it just has to do with it. He is the first president that was not of a generation that understood the trauma, or was adult at the time of the trauma of the 6-Day War, and then of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And so, I think the people who are grappling with what they perceive as a lack of sensitivity, and to throw into here, obviously there's also the issue that not just on this issue, talk to gay Americans, and you'll say, well, he's right on our issues, but it's really difficult to get an emotional response from him. You'll hear an echo of, talk to black Americans, you're going to get the same thing to a degree. You'll hear an echo of that. He's a reserved guy. I think that's part of it. But I think that the people who are upset with him for what they perceive as a lack of sensitivity of some of his predecessors, they're going to have to get used to that as presidents get younger and younger, are born later and later, and did not live during a time when there was a true threat to Jewish existence. This is the first, and it's just going to go on like this. There's going to be a natural alliance based on shared interests. I don't think that it's going to have the emotional resonance that it has had in your lifetime and in my lifetime.
That's a wonderful insight, Ron. Very, very interesting. In general, then, do you think there will be any political fallout from Israel's Operation Protective Edge?
I don't think so. I think one of the interesting things is with Netanyahu is, as much as he gets hit by anti-Israel critics, by just critics of Israel in general for being supposedly right-wing, he shows far greater restraint, far greater caution than a lot of his predecessors. Compare the 2012 operation that happened under his watch with the 2009 operation under Ehud Olmert's watch. It was much more contained. This is not a guy who likes to go overboard in anything. He's very calculating in a good way. It's why he keeps on winning elections, and it's why he's at least until now he's kept Israel secure. He talks a very strong rhetoric, but that's what happens in the Middle East. But in terms of actions, he doesn't go overboard. And so, yeah, there are going to be people who are going to criticize Israel no matter what. But I don't think you're going to get the same, the same sort of incidents that, let's say, you had in 2009, where there were a lot of people killed in one instance or another, and Israel got pushback for that. I don't think that's going to happen this time.
Ron Kampeas, I always enjoy learning from you. Thank you for making time for Shalom TV audience. We will call you often, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you.
You be well. Ron Kampeas, the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, Ron Kampeas of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. I hope you've enjoyed hearing, again, person after person who've been on Shalom TV, trying to give you a sense of what's going on between Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and Hamas, and in general. It's my hope that all of Shalom TV programming can simply enlarge your understanding. And again, I hope that ultimately we are a television channel on every American cable system, so that not only you who are watching now or you who are watching on computer all over America, on Roku, all American can really benefit from the people who we have on all the time. And again, I thank you for all of the wonderful emails you send me. Please, let me know your own thinking. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from many of you. And please follow me if you tweet at Rabbi Mark Golub. That's my tweet handle. And you've heard some people refer to the tweets I've been doing lately. So follow me. My thanks, of course, to this wonderful Shalom TV staff that surrounds me and makes all this possible. Our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, associate director, Dara Golub, and to the wonderful producers who've been working with me minute by minute for the past few days, Carol Lilienthal and Ron Jacobson. I love you all, and most of all, I love you. You who watch us every day here on Shalom TV. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.